Welcome back into our class TH100 Systematic Theology, and we've been in part 2, which is titled Theology and Philosophy. Theology and Philosophy. And now we've looked at the various philosophies that have impacted theology throughout the last 150, 250 years, and continues to have a big impact on theology today. Now, as you well know, I continue to repeat myself, and that is many pastors, they come into the pulpit, they've read 4 or 5 different books besides the Holy Scriptures, but they have no idea what the 5-6 authors, who these 5-6 authors, who they're following, and who they're following, and you can begin to glean and get an idea that they have a mixed bag, they have a mixed salad of all of these different philosophical foundational background issues that's come into the life of these various authors and these various theologians, and then they come to the pulpit and they put it together. No wonder we are slipping away from the centrality of the Word of God. So now we want to pick up in this next section, which is going to be here, theology's use of philosophy. How does theology use philosophy? Now, the idea that you're never going to use philosophy, that's erroneous. We better get that very clearly understood, because the Apostle Paul understood exactly how to use it in the book of Acts. And if you remember, at the very beginning of this section 2, Theology and Philosophy, we had noted that there was a variety of relationships that can exist between theology and philosophy. Now, what should be, so the question then becomes both a statement and a question. What should be the role and the place of philosophy in our theology? That's what we're going to attempt to arrive at in this particular session. Now, let me propose two basic guidelines. First of all, in keeping with our fundamental presuppositions, presuming we have those, correct? So in keeping with our fundamental presuppositions, revelation rather than philosophy will supply the content of our theology. Let me repeat that. All right? Let me repeat that. As I told you at the very beginning of this particular course here, this will be a long, drawn-out, boring course, because what it's doing is digging at the foundation of much of our thinking when we enter the pulpit as a result of our Bible study and studying all kinds of subjects at seminary and Bible school, Bible institutes, Bible universities, and so forth and so forth. Right? And so we've not come to the point and to understand the incredible impact of these various authors and who they're following is having upon our life, and how it impacts and shapes when we come to a pulpit and we put our Bible down at the pulpit and we put our teaching notes down, right? And we begin to teach and preach the Word of God. Now, so I want you to understand, so I'm going to repeat again, okay? That is, revelation rather than philosophy will supply the content of theology. That's clearly my position. That revelation, the revelation of the Word of God, should supply, okay, rather than philosophy, should supply the content of our theology. So I'm going to stand on that. This is one of those hills that one stands on and is willing to die on. Now, so revelation will be in turn to first supply the major tenets of our understanding of reality. So the Word of God has to be the very first source that we go to supply all of the major points, the major tenets, the major doctrines, the major teachings of our understanding of reality. So this is going to give us some basic framework, if you will, within which our philosophizing will proceed. And if you go back and you study the book of Acts and you watch how Paul did it, Paul understood that philosophizing, was a vehicle by which to take the message, but it was not the content of that vehicle. He understood that very, very clearly. Now, so our basic stance, what should it be? Our basic stand then falls somewhere between the first and the second positions, okay, that we're going to be looking at, okay? And so I want you to understand that. So here, let's begin to do this. Now, while philosophy, fall will be employed, there will be no commitment to one system of philosophy. We know that because Paul did that. Right? You go, well, why do we haven't even talked about philosophy? What do you even bother with that? Well, because the Apostle Paul used it effectively. He understood the thinking of his audience. He understood the thinking. If you go back and you look at this very carefully, okay, he understood the difference between Acts 17 and Acts 19. He was very, very clear about that when he dealt with these people. Because Paul was not just a preacher, he was not just a teacher of the Word of God. We know that, right? But he was a very well-educated man, so he understood his audience. Now, so rather than just trying to rely on one type of philosophy, okay, we're going to insist on the autonomy of theology. On the autonomy of theology. See, I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that it's theology and philosophy have been married, okay, or that these happen to be kissing cousins. I don't subscribe to that. But I do believe that theology stands on its own. But I also understand that in order to interact in this world that we live in, which philosophy flows through it consistently, and that we're going to have to employ or at least understand the philosophical positions in our audience and the people that we deal with. So rather, we're going to insist that the autonomy of theology, and thus that the explication and the explanation of the revealed content will not be required to conform my particular system of philosophy. So, yet, Christian theology has a definite world view. And now we're beginning to draw closer and closer to where we want to really zone in on. Because theology has a world view. So does philosophy. That's the reason why I insist that theology must be autonomous. Now the Bible quite clearly affirms theistic, and specifically monotheistic understanding of reality. There's a theistic and monotheistic reality of how we understand the world to be. And I don't think that we should question that. Nevertheless, okay, the supreme reality, let's put it these terms. The supreme reality is a personal, all-powerful, all-knowing, loving, and holy being whom we call God. He has created everything. He has created everything else, not by some kind of an emanation from his being, but by bringing it all into existence without the use of pre-existing material. And we need to establish that. And I realize that you're men of God, you've been around a long time, and you've been teaching and preaching the full counsel of the Word of God, and teaching and preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. I understand that. But what happens is that you get sucked into philosophical paradigms and don't even realize you're being sucked in because you can't recognize the language that's being used. So we're going to have to establish that Christian metaphysics is dualism, okay, in which we refer to two types of levels of reality. There's the supernatural level and there's the natural level. There's the supernatural and there's the natural level, and a contingent dualism in which all that is not God has received its existence from Him. Again, God preserves, okay? He preserves in existence the whole creation and is in control of all that happens, and as history moves through the fulfillment of all of His purposes. So I have to keep that at the forefront of my mind. I have to keep it because it's so easy to lose sight of it when we get trapped into philosophical thinking and philosophical systems of thought. So everything, and I mean by the word everything, I mean everything. Everything is dependent upon Him. And the human, the highest of God's creatures, that's us, humanity, okay, is like Him, personal, and hence capable of having social relationships with other humans and with God. Nature is not merely neutral. And we need to understand. Okay? Nature is not merely neutral given. Okay? It is under God's control. Right? And while ordinary functions in the uniform and predictable ways in which there's an obedience to the laws, okay, but He has structure. God has structure into it. He has structure in nature. We tend to look at nature as something that's just random and it's always shifting and moving and it's unpredictable. It's not. It's not. God created it. God is not a God of confusion. And so He does also act within it in ways that contravene these normal patterns in which we recognize as miracles. So, with this as a starting point, the Christian theologian is to use the capacity of reasoning. Christianity requires reasoning. Christianity requires thought. Christianity requires, thinking. Okay? Right? So we need to understand it. So it's the capacity of reasoning given by God to work out all of what? All of the implications of the revealed body of truth that's in His Word. In other words, one philosophizes, from the position or the perspective that's created by the divine revelation. We don't take an external philosophical thought system and then bring it and impose it upon the Word of God. No, we take the Word of God as our content, and from that position we can philosophize, and that's exactly what the Apostle Paul did. No. In this respect, my position, and if I look at all of the well-known writers, and at this level as masters and doctoral students, you should know who all these people are by now. I've looked at a number of them because, I was a young student back in 1972, 73, 74, back in that era, and I got to tell you something. I really did not have the grasp of a lot of the issues that I have today. But I do remember the names clearly, and I do remember having to study these people when I was at the university in those years. Now that I've pastored and preached and been a preacher and a teacher of the Word of God for more than 3 decades, going on 4 decades very soon here, the thing that I now can appreciate is who these people were, and going back and studying who these people are, I can now clearly see who would I align myself closest to if I had to do that. Okay, well, so my position would be close to Carl F. H. Henry. Carl F. H. Henry, who maintains that the biblical worldview is the starting point and the framework for all intellectual endeavor. Now, I remember I'm at a secular university, and as I already mentioned to you, back in the early 70s, and I remember this very clearly that the professors back then, I mean, think about it. This is 2020. This is 2020. Soon we're about to turn the corner into 2021. And I'm talking to you back in 1972, 73, 74, in that time frame, And even back then, you could see the professors clearly attacking theology, attacking biblical worldview, attacking the Word of God. That was very, very clear to me. But I didn't have a foundation to really grasp what all that was about. So, and one of the issues was that it was always attacking intellectual endeavor. And I remember I had to take all these philosophy classes, I had to take all these psychology classes, and I had no clue that I was being sucked into human secularism. I had no clue about that. But I was being sucked in, that was clear. Look. And it also agrees with Edward Ramsdell, Ramsdell is another name, Arthur Holmes, that Christian theology is perspectival. It is perspectival. Now, I can now go back and argue those issues with those professors. Now, So if you're going to take biblical concepts as the tenets, as the main teaching of one's view of reality, is what it restricts considerably the range. It's going to restrict. Look, I already showed you. I showed you all these different ranges, right? And we looked at this together as we looked at this. And I want you to understand this, that as we go back to this, I want you to see this with me, because if I was going to take these ranges, right? And we have this range of pragmatism, which is a philosophy. We have existentialism, which is a philosophy. We have analytical philosophy. We have process philosophy. We have deconstruction. And I'm going to tell you something. These 5 main areas, okay, if you look at all of them, and I find them as destructive, completely destructive, and very effective tools in the hands of the enemy, which is why he's been inserting himself more and more into the churches. He's inserting himself more and more into Bible institutes, Bible schools, Bible colleges, Bible universities, seminaries, and biblical universities, and so forth and so forth. So you're seeing this absolutely everywhere. Look. And so, but when you look at from a theistic, and you take a theological perspective of a worldview, then what it's going to do is going to restrict considerably all of these philosophical systems, okay, and the range of philosophical worldviews that are acceptable. So you can begin to wind these things out, and you can begin to narrow it and narrow it and narrow it. So, for instance, let's take a naturalistic worldview is excluded. That should be pretty obvious to us, okay? Both because it restricts reality to the system of observable, okay, nature, right? Which is the scientific position. Why? Because possible occurrences within this system are restricted to what is conformity and with its fixed laws. And then we can look at the issue of materialism. Materialism, okay, is even more emphatically opposed by biblical revelation. That should be clear to us. And similarly, most idealisms are excluded insofar as they tend to deny the reality of the material world and the transcendence of God. So, let's begin to look at this from a couple of other perspectives. Have you ever heard of the name of Edgar Sheffield Brightman? Edgar Sheffield Brightman, okay? And if not, you should look him up. Okay? He has spoken of he's spoken about 4 types of idealism. Idealism, okay? And if you're honest about it, this is one of the issues that you see all over the world, where people want to talk about idealism. So let's look at 4 different types as they fit into this kind of a conversation that we're attempting to have here. Okay? We have the first one is called Platonic from Plato. Okay? And the value is, and here the value is objective. It's objective, okay? In other words, its origin and meaning are more than human. So you're taking it out of the subjective, okay? And it's clearly objective. And then we have the Berkeleyan, B-E-R-K-E-L-E-I-A-N, the Berkeleyan, which is reality is mental. Reality is mental. Okay? In other words, it says that material objects have no independent being, but exist only as concepts in the mind. In the mind. And then we have the Hegelian, which would be Hegelian, 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 okay? And it says that reality is organic. So remember now, in these 4 types of idealism, we're talking about reality, okay? So Platonic, that means that value is objective. In the Berkeleyan, it means that reality is mental. Now, in the Hegelian, it says reality is organic. It's organic. Well, what does that mean? Well, that is that the whole has properties. It has properties which its parts do not possess. Ultimate reality, okay, is nothing but the manifestation of reason. Now, if you've been paying attention, I hope you have. Or you decided to take a nap. You're in for a shock, because this one here is the one where we get things about what does this verse mean to you? What is it? How is it real to you? Well, truth is truth until it's truth for me. Right? And so you get this kind of thinking that's flowing in many postmodern churches today. And then we have the Lausian, okay, and that's Lotzan, the Lausian, okay, or the Leibnizian, okay, which is, okay, in other words, reality is personal. Reality is personal, okay. Only persons or selves are real. Only persons or selves are real. Now, it would seem to me that the first type, when we talk about the Platonic, right, of idealism, okay, can be assimilated within Christian theology. It can. And the fourth can have certain limitations, which will be the Lausian, okay, by adopted and limitations be adopted by Christian theology. Now, but when we look at the two, okay, the second one, which is the Berkelian, and the third one, which would be the Hegelian, right? They seem to be clearly incompatible with the tenets or the main teachings of Christian theism, as we've already mentioned already. Now, and perhaps the most compatible type, perhaps, of the metaphysics is some form of realism, provided that it includes a supernatural dimension rather than limiting itself to nature. So, worldview here. So the worldview here is presented as objectivism. Objectivism. God is the standard by which we measure all reality. Now, by this is meant that there are objective measures of the true. There are objective measures of the good. There are objective measures of the right. You don't have the right, okay, to define your own form of right. You don't have the right to define your own forms of good. You don't have the right to define your own forms of truth. So the God who is the center of the worldview revealed in the scriptures, it has to be in the scriptures, is capable of both emotion and action as well. Yet he is fully perfect, right? Yet he is fully complete, and yet, okay, he is fully revealed, okay, and I want you to understand that, and he is fully unchanging. God doesn't change. He doesn't change. And so you need to understand. So there are also norms and values that have permanence. So when we look at the norms and the values, okay, that we find in the scriptures and Holy Writ, it has permanence. It's not changing. It's not this organic thing that's always in a state of being of morphing. Okay? We have things like love. We have things like truth. We have honesty. These things are enduring. They're enduring, okay, and they're enduringly good. Why? Because they correspond to the unchanging nature of God. Thus, process philosophy, you remember when we studied that, okay, does not seem to be a viable alternative, because process philosophy turns this thing all upside down. Now, if you go back and you study what we talked about in process philosophy, you will clearly understand what I'm talking about. Now the worldview here presented also regards truth as unitary. Truth as unitary. Rather than being one kind of a truth, objective, in regard to, like, for example, scientific matters, okay? And then there's another type of truth that they call subjective in matters of religion. Truth has something in common in all areas. Truth, so what's truth? So truth is a quality, okay, of statements or propositions that agree with the way things are. Let me repeat that. So truth is a quality of statements or propositions that agree with the way things are. Now, even if you take Take another person, William James. William James, for example. Okay, he was the great pragmatist. If you remember when we studied this in pragmatic philosophy, he was the great pragmatist. Okay, he gives a similar definition of truth, which is kind of ironic, given that he comes from that school of thought is that the means justifies the ends kind of thinking. So let me give you his definition of this. He says this: truth, as any dictionary will tell you, is a property of certain of our ideas. It means their agreement, as falsity means their disagreement with reality. Pragmatists and intellectualists both accept this definition as a matter of course. You go, well, how did you get there? Well, see, God and reality are what they are, independent of anyone's perceiving. God's reality, God and his reality, they're independent of anybody's understanding. God and reality are independent of anybody's appreciating. God and truth and reality are independent of anybody accepting them. Right? That's objective truth. Right? Now, while the knower's reaction is important, right? Your reaction, my reaction, the truth is not dependent, on that reaction. Truth does not depend on whether I accept it or not. Truth is truth. Thus, any type of subjective idealism has to be precluded on our use of philosophy in theology. Right? And so here we are. Here's where we have to get to throwing out existentialism, even though it exists in the pulpits, in many pulpits, in many churches, in the lives of many pastors and preachers, as well as many people sitting in the audience in the congregation. So now we come to a next section, which is logic. So logic is applicable to all truth. And this is where we throw the famous monkey wrench into this deal. Because logic has to be acceptable to all truth. And yet you find all forms of truth, that are not logical. Look, while some areas are clothed in mystery and may therefore be beyond our ability to understand what the relationship is, what relationships are involved, no areas are to be believed to be inherently contradictory. Which is why people struggle with the parables and they struggle with paradoxical truths that exist in the Bible, because they don't understand the logic behind it. Okay? So we have this thing called coherent thought, right? We have coherent thought, or at least communication. Depends on this assumption that we have some kind of a coherent thought. Right? So truth is a quality of propositions, not something that happens to them as a result of how we react or how they are used. Thus, a thoroughgoing, if I can use that fancy old term that we don't seem to use anymore, a thoroughgoing of functionalism also must be regarded as unattainable. So existentialism, functionalism, pragmatism, it's just unattainable. Right? Because it depends on circumstances. Right? Now, let's look at our second basic guideline. I'm going to look at our second basic guideline, and I want to look at that with you. And let's begin to look at this. Is that philosophy should be thought of primarily as an activity. It's an activity. Philosophizing rather than as a body of truth. So philosophizing is basically the vehicle by which we take the content of theology in this human secular world that we live in, and we deliver the content without changing the content. Whereas all the other philosophies that we talked about pragmatism, we talked about analytical philosophy, we talked about process philosophy, we talked about deconstruction, remember that? We look at all of these different philosophies, and they become the content unto themselves. It becomes the, as Dr. Fleetwood always talks about, it's your theological grid. It's the glasses it's the monoculars that you use to see everything through. Well, our grid, our lens has to be theology. What does the word, as revealed by God in His Word. So it has to be that. And this is exactly what we're going to pick up in our next session.